Welcome back to Content That Grows. Today, I'm really excited to be sitting down with Raven Haynes, who's on our team, and she holds the role of content production manager for us, but has a lot of experience in SaaS content as a writer, as an editor, and in this role as well. So, really excited to have you with us today, Raven.
Pumped to be here.
Sweet. Yeah. So the context is, today we're really going to dig into how to create quality content, specifically that's unique from others. So, as we're thinking through this episode, it's essentially from, prior episodes. If you haven't listened to them, definitely go check them out for this season. But you now know who your ICP is. You've identified some of the relevant topics. You've created a roadmap of topics. You understand topic clusters, kind of done all of that. You want to speak to your audience pain points, and now you just need to actually create the content. So in this episode, we're just going to be covering key parts of the process to actually creating quality content that stands out from others. So jumping in, Raven, I'd love for you to just kind of give us an idea of like, what are the 3 to 5 biggest differentiators in your experience between like content that's just okay and truly great pieces of content?
Yeah, definitely. So, okay versus great. Great being those pieces that you want to send to everybody you know, or maybe use with leads and customers, all of that. I'd
Yeah.
say number one would be it has a unique angle and insights. So, examples, anecdotes, something that shows the reader or listener or watcher that your company gets it, that you understand where they're coming from and the topic, its importance to them, and how it plays, in their everyday. Number two would be it gives your readers actionable steps. So something that they can come away with, that they can act on. So, of course, like a CTA, additional reading. Number three would be that it uses recent data. So, statistics, surveys, news resources, something that lets you tell your story, but then also backs up the claims that you're making in the piece.
Yep.
Number four would be, of course, following writing best practices, matching your brand's voice and style and all that, but then also the mechanical, just, is everything capitalized consistently, grammar and style. And then number five, I'll circle back to that one, but number five,
Yep.
it should include visuals when they're necessary, when they're helpful. We don't have to rely on text alone. Sometimes the best way to communicate something is to just, draw it out. So I'd say those are
Yep.
the big five.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, and I would love to definitely dig in a little bit more. If you have any examples of a few of those that you mentioned, would be great. But if not, love to at least just kind of dig in on that, like the quality of the writing best practices, the importance of like the brand's voice and style. All of that I think is super interesting.
Yeah. So number four, the writing best practices. So that's just having your own set of internal writing guidelines, and different companies and agencies approach that differently. A lot of people will like build their foundation on AP style book, that's our go-to, or like the Chicago
Yep.
manual, and then just kind of like brand and style, whatever lines up with that. Like if our tone is friendly and pretty casual, it's as simple as spelling out, like we say don't instead of do not. We
Sure.
love contractions. Talk to them like they're your friend, just kind of reminders as you're writing. Yeah, and then circling back to number one, that's a huge one for us. Content that has a unique angle and insights. That's something that we will meet with clients on and do subject matter expertise intake calls. So
Yep.
just basically a mini interview and getting their thoughts. We'll try and come up with the most thought-provoking questions we can to get their opinions on the topics, and just add that kind of like special twist of lime to every piece.
Yep.
Um, and then, yeah, also giving the writer the autonomy to do their own research and dig into, other pieces out there that are competing with us, other, first party resources and data to see, what are some good case studies? What are some good examples of whatever it is we're talking about? Like
Yep.
make a connection to the real world. So, yeah, those are some quick examples.
Cool. Yeah, I agree. I think the unique angle insights is super interesting. I feel like for a while there was such a focus, especially within like SEO content in particular, around like, well, just look at whoever's ranking first and write more than they did, like write a more comprehensive or longer, and it was all about like the word count, and
Yeah,
it doesn't necessarily have to be that. It's just so many of the posts, even in the top 10, can often be kind of without an angle, or just sort of like people kind of talk about like commodity content, or like sort of just like carbon copies of each other. And
yeah,
so even it's easy to kind of hit on the elements that will make it optimized and rank, but it's that angle that really makes it go from okay to great. And I think that's been super interesting. And really, whether you're working with an agency or in-house, I think that's just an important step to make sure that's part of the process, is kind of understanding how do you have that unique angle.
totally. Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
and then also building off of that one real quick, like, you know, the best writers are not necessarily the subject matter experts. They know how to take what we give them through detailed briefs and with those subject matter expert notes, they know how to leverage that. You're not always going
Yep.
to have an actual engineer writing a post about, like the best engineering meeting, uh, agendas or something.
Sure.
So,
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
yeah.
That's a great point.
When it comes to content creation, you're not always starting from scratch. So sometimes you're improving and optimizing what's already there. So if you were trying to make a SaaS company's existing content better, where would you start? And what would your evaluation process be?
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and it's definitely something that's I've run into a number of times over the years, but also I think it's common for any sort of content marketers or marketing leaders coming into a new company, that they aren't starting from scratch. So one, I think is kind of going back to a lot of what we talked about with the um, again, understanding your ICP, who is your target audience, and just really sort of meticulously evaluating all the existing content through that lens. And just in a few ways, like if you're just, this is our audience, this is what they care about, read a post. Do you have the topical depth? Like, is it actually fully covering it, or does it just feel like you barely touched on it and then ended the
Mm-hmm.
post quickly? The organization of your blog and just all of your content, not even just the blog content, like, is it easy to understand? Is it siloed into all videos, all ebooks, all blog posts, or do you have it kind of organized in a way that's easy for your audience to understand? And then also just the overall quality of writing, like you were just saying, like, is there consistent tone? Is it like consistent capitalization of stuff? Does it feel read well? Just all that stuff I think is important too, because you may be inheriting a variety of quality of writers over the years or whatever.
Yeah.
So I'd say that's like an area to start, but really just from your target audience perspective, you know, look at it from that, and not just the data of like how much traffic it currently generates. Um, and I would say the biggest area where companies go wrong with that is like, when you think about a company that's had a blog for even just 5 years, a lot can change with your product and sort of what you're trying to do as a company. A lot of it's common for companies to make pivots. So not even just like, starting SMB and moving up market, there may still be relevance there, but if you do kind of pivot and really focus on a specific ICP, or you do say, hey, we're just going to be enterprise only now or whatever, I think it's really important to kind of go back through all of your content and look through that lens and understand, like, are there things we just shouldn't have on here anymore because it's just very disconnected from what we're doing. So that would be another area, because you could just kind of have this weird mix of, like, for you it feels like, oh well, all the posts in the last year are all related to what we're doing now, but that's not necessarily how people find you and how they consume your content. So just trying to make sure you kind of think holistically about that experience and not overwhelm people.
Yeah. Yeah. Tons of great points in there. Um,
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that
Have
was,
you? Good.
I was just gonna say, I think that was a good call out too. Like when your feature set changes or just a small adjustment, or if you start targeting a different audience, I think like you might think that as a writer or an editor, you might see a lot of opportunities to say, oh, we just did a piece about that, or I remember a piece from 4 years ago that would be great to link to here. But it's also those kind of like those
Yeah.
fundamentals, basically, like going back and clarifying, updating a price or mentioning that this feature can now do this as well. And just it can
Yes.
be a quick pop into an old piece and update it that way too. And that increases the value and like the accuracy by a million.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, yeah, you just made me think of another, which is a great point, that product screenshots as well can get outdated quite quickly. So that's yet another area that to kind of have to be able to sweep through, which, certainly for product marketers and anyone kind of thinking through that and how the product is represented is super, can be like super daunting when you get to a point where
Yeah.
you have, thousands of blog posts and whatnot. So there's
Yes.
certainly, that's probably a conversation for another time on how to have some systems and processes around updating product references across a lot of content. But yeah, that's a great addition. So with that, like in your opinion, what are some of the like must-have ingredients for an effective content workflow? That's obviously something that we've, as an agency, have to work on and focus on extensively because that's a big part of what we do. But in-house teams is a huge factor as well. So just kind of going from like having an idea for content, or we talked about like maybe a roadmap of ideas or whatever, just from an idea all the way through the piece being published effectively. What do you think are some of the must-have aspects of that?
Yeah. So doing the 30,000 foot view, of course, starting with, like we talked in previous episodes, your strategy, your research, the bread and butter to put the roadmap of topics together. Um,
Yep.
then, of course, walking through that with the client, just kind of going through that journey together and talking them through, what makes sense now, what makes sense later, what did we not think of, what is going to matter the most to your audience right now. And of course, supporting all of that with like our SEO tools, project management tools to share it and to start thinking through it as a team. And then distilling those approved topics into detailed briefs. So, again, the strategy, the research, and we also have actually a brief template in our blog that kind of goes through that. And I'll talk about that in just a little bit about what a detailed brief
Yep.
is. But yeah,
Yep.
detailed brief, do any SME intake if we need to do that. Then once our briefs are in a good spot, sending them over to great writers. So that's that's a story in itself,
Yep.
how to hire
Yep.
awesome writers in-house freelance. But yeah, setting them up for success with great briefs, with the details from the clients, and also being available as a team for any on the fly communication, any questions that they have, and getting the piece written off to our editors who do awesome work,
Yep.
and then finally to the client for any feedback, for any revisions. And yeah, just throughout that entire process, being ready to communicate, being available, just keeping an eye on any changes. The client might pop up and say, hey, can we add this in? Or we just scored an awesome interview last week. It'd be great to work that in there. So just kind of being ready to
Yep.
iterate, and communicating that, we're on a team, like our agency and the client, like we're in this together.
Yep.
If they succeed, we succeed. And the more we share, the better, the content turns out.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah, and I think it's so interesting too because it's uh yeah, I think you certainly mentioned that in sort of the framework of agency and client, but it's 100% the same in-house because you mentioned like planning and like is there anything else we need to consider coming up, like that's very much an in-house thing. Like there are other campaigns going on or other product announcements or things you need to understand coming up, and the same thing with just like yeah, just you find out recent press mention or whatever it may be that wants someone wants to integrate that into the post you just wrote or whatever. So totally
Yeah.
makes sense. And would definitely love to kind of jump back to what you were talking about with the detailed briefs. Um, in in my experience, and certainly now having had the opportunity to talk to a lot of people about content marketing and SEO, like anytime I hear someone say, "Oh, we've tried to have people outside of our company write for us, and it was terrible,"
Hmm.
um, my first question is like, well, what was that process like? And it's common that they're they like, well, they just we sent them a topic or whatever, or they picked a topic and wrote about it. But there's
Yeah.
no brief, and I think that there's so much that happens in that content brief for the research, understanding the context, shaping the content, all of that. And then you mentioned as well the SME process, which is essentially, SME standing for subject matter expertise, like making sure that we understand the unique perspective of a client and their point of view on the market or the topic or whatever. So a little bit easier on that part when you're in house because you just sort of naturally have that for most things. But
Yeah.
um, those to me are two of the biggest things that take something from, oh, we asked someone to write about this topic, just no guardrails whatsoever,
Right.
to here's a very clear understanding, not like, they still have the ability to be creative and write within it, but giving them a more clear understanding of what they want to happen with it and the unique subject matter expertise to integrate into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And having been a freelance writer, I've been in house, I've, now at an agency. I've seen the gamut, like
Hmm.
I've received assignments or briefs where they give you like their bare bones, the topic basically, and like an understanding of what the word count should be. And then I've had companies, clients like give me the full plate, like the entire list of keywords, yeah, a rough outline. And so, I do think there's a balance to be struck with the level of detail that you provide so that it's not such a big ask, a big weight on your own team to do all the upfront, like the heavy lifting.
Yeah.
However, generally, it's like, yeah, when you're creating content at scale, when you're looking for consistency, when you're collaborating with, legal and with marketing and, other departments, and you're driving toward these ambitious search goals, you've got to have reliable briefs. You have to spell it out a little bit,
Yeah.
and that's not something that necessarily holds the writers back either. It lets them do their best work. They know where to start, and
Yeah.
they can save that time doing more research, doing more writing, doing more self editing, and give you the best piece, the best like bang for your buck, quote unquote. And also frees up their schedule to keep cranking out awesome pieces for you. So
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yep. What do you? Yeah, and I think um, you just mentioned sort of like self editing, which I think is a great point there, in that they just have more time to polish it a little more and get it to you. Um, what do you
exactly.
think the value? So like consistent editing, I think is um, also a huge piece that like drives towards the consistency of the tone of the voice and all that stuff. Like, what are your thoughts on that? Because I think there's a lot of focus on like, is it a good writer or not? But obviously, editors are a huge factor in everything. So, I'd love just kind
Yeah.
of your thoughts on that. Having sent stuff to editors, worked with different editors, been an editor, like,
Yeah.
how do you think that shapes into the overall aspect of just being able to consistently create high quality content?
Yeah. I mean, I could talk for the rest of my life about it.
Yeah.
If I had to whittle it down, I mean, your editors are everything. They're the last pair of eyes. They're teachers, especially like when you have that SEO element in there, like their understanding and their ability to communicate it to writers. If a writer pops up and says, "I'm finding this as I'm researching. Is it okay if I, swap this out?" Like they're that, from an SEO perspective, like they're that go between they're the ones
Yeah.
who are going to quickly break down that SEO concept and say, well, we do need to have a section that addresses these points, but absolutely, like if that's what the data is saying, that's what the research is saying, let's modify it this way and still like reach our goals together. Um, and then yeah, just from like a brand voice and style standpoint, it's they're just kind of like that point of reference. They see it all goes through them, so they're able to just, get everything aligned and looking and sounding the same, hopefully. And then also once it goes to the client and you get that feedback, they'll take it straight back to the writer. And so you can just keep building and improving. So it's so essential.
Yeah.
It's so key to the process.
Yeah. That's great. So then again, kind of as someone who's managed writers and edited content and been a writer, and we talked about the importance of that content brief and what that does for helping create the best content possible. What do you think are a few of the like key elements that need to be in that content brief for the writer and for the best result?
Yeah, absolutely. So essential brief elements would be, of course, the title and the meta description. That's just kind of can be your shorthand for what is this piece about and what needs to be in it.
Yeah.
A word count range, any key grammar and style notes for the writer to follow. Um, we like to put in good examples of competitor content for educational purposes, understand,
Yeah.
what's out there. Um, and then an actual blog outline with instructions, and they can be as loose as explain XYZ or expand on this header. But again, just a framework for the piece. Any important internal or external links that they should include,
Yeah.
as well as CTA recommendations. And then, of course, priority keywords or a keyword tool like a clear scope and all the other ones out there.
Sure. Cool. Yeah, I think it's great, and it really is. Yeah, I think a lot of times it can kind of get represented as like an outline, like, oh, okay, you're just providing an outline, but it really is like a substantial amount of that research that, and a little bit of the writing, like title tag and some of that stuff. Like it's quite a bit of the research component that a writer doesn't have to do because it's sort of pulled in the angle, like roughly idea how long it needs to be, the competitor aspects, the internal links is a really big one. I think a lot of times gets missed. So yeah, so that's great. All of that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I can just speaking to the links alone, like I just remember that being such whenever when I was getting started freelance writing, that's like one of the biggest, I feel like, I would say like mountains to climb or something whenever you're first starting with a client is just like even like we were talking about from like a content management perspective
Mm-hmm.
is an understanding of like what they've already written, what they've already talked about. As a writer, you want to, of course, link where it makes sense and include a couple because you're writing best practices. So now you
Yep.
get to like manually go through their entire catalog and see what's been done and see what to link to. And that alone, especially when it's a new client for you, is just like, hours. It could be.
Sure.
Um,
Yep.
over the course of the relationship. So even that alone is like time saver. They can focus on, like we talked about, just writing the best quality piece.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, and then from a strategy perspective, that instead of it being a writer, or if you have multiple writers and their own perspectives on what's relevant, you kind of have a consistent editor, or sorry, not consistent, a consistent strategist who's understanding, here's the topics, here's the ones I want to connect from a topic cluster perspective, and has a lot more context than any one writer might have, as they're getting some of the posts or whatever, just having some of the context in working with that. So yeah, that's great. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, exactly. And like, don't link to our 2006 weird FAQs piece.
Yeah, totally.
Don't do that.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, rounding it out, we talked a lot about okay versus great content. So when it comes to great content, who do you think are 2 to 3 companies who embody that?
Yeah, I think it's there's a lot. I think a lot of companies that do well. There's obviously even more that don't, and that's just sort of the nature of it. But I think there's certainly a number of examples that we can look to for that. The first I would say is certainly HubSpot. I think they're well known in like creating SEO content, and have been commonly used as an example for that. But one of the things that I wanted to call out with that one specifically is that they we talk about sort of like your ICP and their pain points and like how that all ties to your business goals and your product and everything. They have a ton of like beginner and intermediate content. It's for sales, marketing, a number of roles. And the important thing is that I think that fits well with their sort of bottoms up approach as a company, having like freemium products and really wanting to just kind of get people in and using it. So be very different if they were, trying to sell multi-million-dollar deals top down. And I'm sure they have some division of that does that, but the bulk of their business is there. So I think that's a really interesting one to call out, that it fits really well with their business model and kind of who they're attracting, and then the relevancy of the product. Another would be Shopify. I think that they have really been a huge leader in sort of the wave of e-commerce, and like people being able to become an e-commerce store or merchant or e-commerce store owner, from 0 to 1. So they have a ton of content there. And I think that's really, there's a lot of really, really quality guides. When you think about going from never having done it to everything, there's all kinds of stuff with all the email drip campaigns and sales tax compliance and shipping and logistics and product sourcing. And there's just so much that goes into it. And I think that their content is a huge like barrier breaker really for anyone who sort of feels overwhelmed, that they can actually read a lot of that content before they even start up a store or figure out what they want their store to be. They can kind of decide like, okay, this feels doable. I feel like the barrier has been lowered because I have been able to educate myself so much. So I think that's another big one. And then the last is Gong. I think they're well known in the SaaS space, especially within the sales community, but super interesting that they just constantly have a very data driven approach. So they're surfacing a lot of unique insights, whether that's the close rate on if you mention pricing in the first call or not, or any of those types of data points that you just aren't really able to find anywhere else. So it's unique. But also, again, I think it fits very well because they're using data in their content to appeal to people to be interested in a product that will give you data on your sales calls. So it's I think it's very, very fitting, and again, just ties really well. So any SaaS company could do that and have proprietary data, but again, it just that one just fits really well. It's a really good understanding of your audience. So that's a few that I would add there, as I think are just great examples of high quality content.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's cool and unique about all of them too is like they all have such volume and like adoption that they are often the source for like all these, highly or widely referenced studies and surveys.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And that's where, you kind of get into that flywheel where
right.
All of a sudden it becomes like the most referenced for content quality or whatever, and then just kind of keeps building, and the flywheel goes from there. So totally agree. But yeah, I think it's great. Like, in terms of like everything we've covered today, and again, sort of the context of like, you understand the topics, you understand what you're trying to do, but actually creating quality content that's unique from others is a really, really big step in the process, and not even just a step, it's just a constant factor in that. And so I love everything we covered from what the elements are, the key content workflow, what needs to be in the content briefs, the importance of editors, and a number of other factors there, as well as some examples, and then also like how to approach evaluating existing content when you're kind of joining an existing or an ongoing program. So
Yeah.
thanks so much for joining today, Raven, and going over all this. I think it's super exciting. And as we kind of continue through this process, next episode we'll be diving into a little bit more on like, Raven mentioned like CTAs, call outs in one point, but we're going to go deep on that topic of, understanding how to pick CTAs and where to put them, and all kinds of stuff in the next episode. So be sure to check that one out. Subscribe or like the podcast if you haven't yet. Feel free to visit 10speed.io/podcast to see past episodes and sign up to get notified via email when we have new ones come out. So thanks, Raven, so much for joining today. This was great.
Thank you. This was awesome.